Welcome to episode 20 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on November 14th, 2019. Today, I'm going to start telling you about Loch Ness Knit Fest, bring you an interview with Tania Ashton Jones about Dorset Buttons, and catch you up on a few things that have happened or are in the works. It occurs to me that it's been quite a few episodes since I've talked about my progress on level 1 of the Master Hand Knitter program. That's in large part because I've been so busy traveling and then working to get caught up with being gone. Literally nothing has been actively done about the program. I do think that this last trip has helped me build some skills and be aware of some areas I need to improve. Next steps will be to finish my essay on care of knits and blocking, and then I'll be back to working on the swatches. There is a chance, if I do very little else, that I can get this in the mail before the end of the year, but the reality of the situation is that I will not meet the year deadline, and that's okay. I'll just need to get the newest incarnation of the program and make sure I use those rules instead of the ones that have expired. Many of you have told me before that you would love to do the Master Hand Knitter program, but you don't have the time, patience, persistence to do it. A month or two ago, the Knitters Guild Association announced an alternative program. It's called the Professional Knitter Certification Program, and it's designed to just focus on knitting skills. So there's no reports, no designing, no pattern writing. Basically, it's a certification program that you can provide to yarn shops or designers to say, here, the Knitting Guild says I know what I'm doing. Hire me to knit your designs or swatches or whatever. The program has 3 modules, and I'll read from their website. Module 1 tests the knitter's skill in basic techniques and the ability to work to gauge by knitting swatches. The project for this level is a toe-up sock with short row heel construction. Module 2 tests the knitter's ability to reproduce more complicated stitch patterns from pattern instructions. The knitter's finishing abilities are tested by knitting and finishing 2 baby sweaters. This module also includes swatches for specialized finishing techniques not demonstrated in the sweaters. Module 3 provides information and tips for successfully working with designers, how to make suggestions, time management strategies, resume and portfolio building, and suggestions for how to contact designers and yarn companies. The graduation project is a real-world situation in which the student works with the instructor to determine a time frame for completing the project and then does so. The instructor will assume the role of the designer. Each module of this course will cost $150. There's an additional $50 shipping fee for international enrollments to cover the higher cost of returning the submission. So there is another option for you if you want some way of certifying your skills without having to go through the additional research involved with the Master Hand Knitter designation. For music this week, I'm about to delve into Loch Ness Knit Fest, so you'd think I'd be playing bagpipes or rich-voiced folk singers, but no. I'm going through my music files and pulling out a couple of songs I like quite a bit. The first one is called Into the Grey by Stacey B. Hogan. Enjoy.
How am I to say what should be said when all I have is you inside my head, echoing the stillness till it's right. I just want to be with you tonight. How can I not love you like I do? You have my heart beating right on cue. For in you there's a glow that's shining through. But in your shadow I can feel it too. If mercy came a little too late, I'd follow you into the grave. And if we ever fall from grace, I promise you I'll never hesitate to follow you into the grave, into the grave. Bittersweet, the taste of my own tears. 'Cause loving you has silenced all my fears, except the one where our love disappears, and a broken heart has made a souvenir. If mercy came a little too late, I'd follow you into the grave. And if we ever fall from grace, I promise you I'll never hesitate to follow you into the grave, into the grave. Fall from grace, I promise you I'll never hesitate to follow you into the grave, into the grave.
I wasn't just in Shetland on my trip to Scotland. I also spent a week in the Highlands and another week specifically in Inverness, which I wrapped up by taking part in Loch Ness Knit Fest. We made no real plans for the week in the Highlands. I booked us a couple of hotels, so I knew what areas we'd be in, but other than that, the plan was just to drive and see what looked interesting to do that day. One day we were driving around and we saw a sign for wool, knitwear, and sheepskin. I still hadn't found a sheepskin, and I'm always in the market for wool. So we turned off the road and had to drive maybe a quarter of a mile until we got to a couple of buildings. There was a cozy little house across the lane from a Kelly green building that reminded me of a temporary classroom, but maybe about half the size. I hopped out of the car and went up to the door, but it was locked. And through the window, all I could see were knickknacks and books and tables with covers over them. So I thought we must be at the wrong spot and needed to go down the road a little bit more. And I went back to the car and we started to pull out. As we were pulling out of the parking space, a little old lady was crossing the lane and asked if we wanted to go shopping. So we said yes. Honestly, thinking it was just books and knickknacks, I wasn't very thrilled with the idea of shopping anymore, but I figured I'd be able to find something as I felt a little badly about making her walk over to open the shop for us. Well, it turned out that all those tables with covers over them were full of wool and knitwear and sheepskins. So I was very glad we went back inside. I found my sheepskin there and got 2 balls of white merino Angora blend lace weight, and we chatted with the owner for a bit and we're off again. Another day we were driving and saw a sign for a sale at the community hall, so we decided to check that out. It was only a very small hall, but there were maybe 5 vendors set up, and we ended up getting something from each of them because I think we legitimately found things we liked from 4 of them, and then it just felt awkward not getting something else from the other fellow. But there was a knitter there selling little handmade items, and I got a pair of her yoga socks. They are knit without the toes and the heels so that you can still grip the floor, but it keeps your feet and ankles warm. We ended up getting some salt made from the ocean water right there, and some jerky made from Highland deer that hadn't had any sugar added to it, and something else that I can't say because it's going to be a stocking stuffer. And then I think from the last fellow we got a decorative knife meant to be tucked into your socks when you're wearing a kilt. But it was such a treat to just be driving around and come across a little craft sale so full of talented people and their creations. Earlier in the trip, I'd gotten an email from a listener named Ailey who lives up the northeast coast of Scotland, and she invited me to visit her knit club if it just happened to line up with our travel plans. Well, it didn't, but it was the perfect excuse to get to drive up the eastern coast, which is an area I wanted to see and wasn't going to get a chance to otherwise. At that point, I was on my own, so I got myself a rental car and I drove up. It was a beautiful drive. The Western Highlands in October were very orange and brown. The bracken had all died off for the year, and it was still gorgeous because we'd had rain and there were waterfalls everywhere, and we saw quite a few Highland deer as we were out. But the East Coast was still green, and the road was high up, usually across a field from the cliffs down to the sea. So you'd be driving and then you'd have a beautiful green field to your right, usually full of sheep, and then the drop off to the ocean. It was a beautiful day and the views were amazing. The road was windy enough to keep you awake, but quiet enough that I was able to enjoy the views without having to constantly be aware of another driver in front of me. I met Ailey at a grocery store parking lot and she drove us over to where they meet in a refurbished croft house. But it was so beautiful outside that we ended up taking tables and chairs and sitting in the sun for a few hours. The ladies in the group were a pleasure and originated from all over the UK, and it was lovely to meet them all and soak in the sunshine. When it was time to wrap up, Ailey and her sister Kirsty took me to John O'Groats for the customary tourist photo with the sign showing all the distances to various points around the world, and then we had dinner before I had to head back. It was really a very special afternoon and definitely a highlight of the trip, so thank you, Ailey, for the invitation. I hope to get back again for another visit. The rest of my trip, I was in Inverness. Inverness is really a lovely little city. There is a large pedestrianized area in the middle of town with stores ranging from the practical to the quirky to those catering to tourists. I got to try 4 or 5 of the restaurants in that area too during the course of the week and was never disappointed. The city still has many of the old buildings in the center for those who love architecture, and there is a river walk that follows the River Ness through town that is perfectly flat to walk and absolutely beautiful. The farther you go upstream, the more wild it gets. Walking the river walk is a gorgeous way to spend an hour or two. If you are there and you do happen to need a big box store or want to see a movie or something like that, that's all still available to you in Inverness. They've just done a good job at keeping all of those places outside of the center of the city, so it still feels like a special place to walk around and explore. I was in Inverness for a full week, and most of the days were blue sky beautiful. I told a friend that I'm pretty sure the people of Scotland have been lying to everyone about their weather to try to keep us away, but we did actually get some rain toward the end. Still, Inverness was a lovely home base for the last week of my trip, and I look forward to going back next year. Because honestly, I had such a fun time at Loch Ness Knit Fest. It was only a week and a half after leaving Shetland, and there were quite a few people who had made it to both events, so it was good to have a little mini reunion there. Plus, there were others I got to meet for the first time, including Joe Spencer, also known as Joe Sky on Instagram, and John Glenn, who's Beardychiel on YouTube. I had a chance to interview Tania Ashton Jones, which you'll hear in a bit, and Crystal Seyfarth, whose interview you'll hear in episode 21. I had a brief chat with Dr. Zoe Fletcher, also known as the Woolist, and quite a few others, including Ailey and Kirsty and a few of the other ladies I'd met on my trip north to Wick for the Knit Club. I only scheduled 1 class per day on Thursday and Friday, so I had enough time to actually get around and chat with people at this event, which was just such a treat after running from event to event through all of Wool Week. My Thursday class was with Stephanie Hoyle and was all about Gansey knitting. I learned so much in this class. First of all, I didn't realize that Ganseys have their own special type of yarn. There are comparably few producers out there making it. It's roughly a sport weight yarn, worsted spun out of 5 plies, and the plies are very tightly spun into the finished yarn. The sweaters are typically knit on very small needles, which makes them wind and water resistant. Gansey sweaters typically have cabling and knit and purl patterning to them, as well as a gusset in the underarm area for ease of movement. The arms are picked up and knit from the armhole down, and then the shoulders are constructed by knitting long straps or tabs, and then the top of the front or back of the sweater are joined to the tab by knitting them together. It's an ingenious method of constructing a sweater without having to sew a single seam. Stephanie was involved with the Moray Firth Gansey project, which recorded the different patterns of Gansey sweaters and is working to pass the skills on to new knitters. She made a comment in class that it's hard to find patterns for real Gansey sweaters. Most aren't knit to the correct gauge, or they just have an all-over cabling pattern and call themselves Ganseys without having the traditional construction. So we asked her for help in finding some traditional patterns. She recommended the book Knitting Ganseys by Beth Brown Reinsel, which I have ordered, and it has arrived, and now I just need time to pick out a pattern and get cracking on one. I honestly didn't expect to be as intrigued by Ganseys as I ended up being, but Stephanie Hoyle was so knowledgeable that her interest was infectious. The next day, I got to have a class with Hazel Tyndall. I was able to interview her for episode 19, so be sure to go back and listen to that episode if you're new to the podcast. Hazel is a very gracious lady. That's the word that comes to mind every time I think about her. She was just very open with her knowledge and really had a knack for putting people at ease. I found her class to be very interesting. It was called Swatching with a Purpose. Basically, we worked a circular coaster-sized bit of Fair Isle from the outer edge inward. She provided us with a heart motif pattern, and we chose colors for the pattern stitches and the background stitches. By the end of the class, we had a little round swatch that we could use as a coaster or hair decoration or brooch, and it was big enough to measure our gauge and see how the colors we chose worked together. If we didn't like it, or if we did, either way, it was a pretty and useful bit of knitting that didn't leave you thinking you just wasted that yarn on a swatch you may never look at again. It was a very clever design and purpose, and I can see myself using it again when I see a pattern I like, but I'm not crazy about the colors the designer chose. A few test swatches using Hazel's pattern, and I should be able to confidently move forward with colors I would prefer to use myself. After this class, Hazel made her presentation called Knitting on Shetland in the 1960s, based on her mother's diaries from the time. Some of that information was shared in last week's interview, and I don't want to get into too much more with you on the podcast because I wouldn't do it justice the way Hazel can, but if you have a chance to hear her present this talk, it is well worth your time. My Thursday and Friday classes were my first experiences of Loch Ness Knit Fest, so I'm going to stop at this point and I'll tell you about all the lovely experiences of the festival in the next episode. You are going to think I'm crazy, but I'm actually getting my adult nieces and nephews a year's supply of Drops laundry detergent for Christmas. I think that's safe to say. I don't think any of them listen to their Nerdy Knitting Aunts podcast. Why would I do such a thing? They are all still at that stage where they are still learning how to be proper adults. And taking one thing off their plate is a huge help. So I'm going to get them each a 4-month family pack of laundry pods from Drops Detergent, which should last them a full year. They will have one less thing to worry about, and I won't be breaking the bank because Drops is the most affordable laundry detergent I have ever found that is actually effective. Our clothes come out of the laundry clean and in good shape every time. They don't use plastic in their packaging, and while I prefer unscented pods for my family, they also offer lovely scented pods if that's your thing. Give them a try yourself or order some for the young adults in your life for Christmas and use our link. You'll get a discount on your first order and you'll be helping support the podcast. Visit tiny.url/drops. That's tiny.url/DROPPS to claim $10 off your first order and help support the show. That's tiny.url/drops. One of the teachers at Loch Ness Knit Fest was a woman named Tania Ashton Jones. I do introduce her in the interview I'm about to play for you, but one thing I don't think gets properly mentioned is that she has her own podcast called TJ Frog, which is written as all one word. She talks about knitting and Dorset Buttons and life on the Isle of Skye. It's a really interesting podcast, so be sure to look for it on iTunes or wherever you normally find podcasts. All her contact information and photos of her Dorset Buttons that she described in the interview will be available in the show notes at ithoughtIknewhow.familypodcasts.com. Without further ado, please enjoy this little interview with Tania Ashton Jones. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Tania Ashton Jones at Loch Ness Knit Fest. She is a blogger, a podcaster, and a seller of wool and Dorset Buttons, and she's agreed to sit down with me for a little bit and answer some questions. Tania, welcome to I Thought I Knew How.
Hi, Anne. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your podcast. Really looking forward to it.
Tania, you are here to teach a class on Dorset Buttons, and I've seen other places where you're teaching about Dorset Buttons. Can you explain what a Dorset Button is for us?
A Dorset Button is a handmade button, and it was a cottage industry in Dorset down on the south coast of England, starting in the early 1600s. And they traditionally used to make the buttons with a disc of sheep's horn and linen thread and linen fabric. And it's now classed as a heritage craft in the UK. So as a knitter myself and loving wool, I've now sort of taken it a stage further in a contemporary way, and I make the buttons, but I use yarn and all different yarns.
And how did you first hear about Dorset Buttons and this craft?
That's a really interesting question, because I was brought up in Dorset and I never learnt about them while I was in Dorset, which I'm actually quite sad about, because there's quite a lot of social history associated with them around some of the towns that I lived very close to. I started knitting again about 10 years ago, and it was through knitting that I heard about the Dorset Buttons. So a friend of ours in the knitting group was a sewer, and a friend of hers made buttons, and she invited her along to our knitting group one day and said, "Have a look at these Dorset Buttons." And that was me. I just made one and loved it.
You mentioned that this was a cottage industry starting hundreds of years ago. Can you tell us more about who was making them and who were buying them?
The Dorset Buttons were predominantly made by women and children, and they used to take them to button depots where they would drop off what they had made, and then the buttons would be graded and sorted and mounted onto 3 different colour cards. So they had a pink card, a yellow card, and a sort of inky blue card, and that was the 3 different qualities. And it's thought that the top qualities would go to royalty or gentry or over onto the sort of continent, and it was the lowest quality really that the sort of peasant people would wear.
Are there still surviving examples from the past that we can look at?
Yes, there's not many. You do have to hunt them out a little bit. There's some museums, particularly down on the south coast in Dorset. There's the museum in Shaftesbury at the top of Gold Hill, because Shaftesbury is thought to be one of the main centres of the Dorset Button industry, and they do have a few samples of different types of Dorset Buttons. And there's a couple of other museums down predominantly, as say, in the south coast of England that do have examples. I'm still trying to research where else there are. Sometimes you find that it's just one museum has got one example, so you've really got to hunt around.
So you brought some examples to the interview. If you could maybe describe what they look like and the general idea of how they're made.
The original Dorset Buttons then started off with a slice of sheep's horn. So almost imagine like a sequin size of horn. So it was the Dorset horn sheep, which was the sheep at the time, which is now a rare breed here. And that little sequin disc of horn sat at the very bottom. And then we've got a linen fabric that was built up into a conical shape. And there's a blanket stitch that's been embroidered all the way around to the very top using very, very fine linen thread. These buttons are, I would say that's about 1 centimetre. These buttons are tiny, and the detail on them is incredible. And then they moved to making a very similar style in terms of its makeup, but more of a dome shape. And this is called the Dorset Knob Button. And some of you may have heard of Dorset Knob biscuits, which are still made down in Dorset, which is, the name from the button. They also made a soft form button, which, if you imagine a sort of donut, a ringed donut shape, but again, tiny. So it was a soft form button with linen fabric that was twisted around into a circle, and then it was covered all in embroidered thread with the blanket stitch going all the way around. And then they moved on over time to using soldered wire. So they made rings out of soldered wire and put the linen fabric over the top of the rings, stitched around the inside of the ring, the inner inside, and then they had little decorations of French knots on top. So they're probably the closest thing that we would recognise to perhaps a machine-made fabric button now, kind of pressed. But, you know, they were handmade and tiny, tiny stitches and detail on them. And over time, they moved from the soldered wire rings with the linen on to just having linen thread. So no fabric, just the linen thread, which would be used to make spokes and designs and patterns on the buttons. And really that's where today's Dorset buttons that you will find, the designs have mainly come from, some of the later original Dorset buttons that have used the linen thread.
These are remarkable, and I will make sure that I get some photos for the show notes so that you can see them, because as Tania said, today we think of the wrapped rings with the spokes going inwards, but these sort of original buttons look quite different in their design. So I'll make sure to put some photos in the show notes for you. But Tania, can you explain a little bit more about, like, sort of, I guess it's weird to call it the modern Dorset button, but the ones that we're likely to encounter in one of your classes?
In my classes, I take the basic techniques from the tradition in terms of how the ring is covered and how we lay spokes and how we build up the inside of the button, because a lot of people think that the button is woven in the middle. So a bit, if you think of a weaving loom where you go over and under, that's how people think of the Dorset button, but it's not. It's actually called rounding the centre. And what happens is you're going over and back under. So you're actually doing a back stitch around all of the spokes. So for me, as a knitter, I like to encourage people to learn the basic technique, but then take it to something that uses their own imagination and creativity, and just see how they can use it with their knitting, their crochet, their sewing projects. We've all, if you work with yarn in any way, have odd scraps of yarn left over. And it's a great way to use up all your little odds and ends. And it's a great way to personalize your own projects that you've made.
I know personally, before making this trip, I knit a cowl out of bulky weight yarn, and the opening for the buttonhole is almost 4 inches wide. And I cannot find a button for it. So my thought is maybe I'm going to go home and make a Dorset button for that with some of the remainder of the yarn. But I can see you've brought several different ones. The different sizes, of course, are going to use up different amounts of yarn. And you're wearing a lovely set of earrings actually made from Dorset buttons. Do you want to talk about some of the different ways people are using them in ways other than as buttons?
Firstly, then you mentioned about a brooch for the cow. So that's something I really try and encourage. You know, whenever I make myself a shawl, I always make myself a Dorset button brooch that goes with the shawl. So I use the odd ends of yarn and sort of make a brooch. And yes, so I do earrings, stitch markers. I had a lady recently who'd bought a kit from me, and she now puts them on her curtains as decoration, and she'd made a bag with them on. You could use them as either as a decoration on a bag or as the actual closure. I've put them on the crown of a knitted hat. So my crofter's hat, I actually put the button right on the very crown, or you can put them on the side. I think once you start making them, you see that there's just so many possibilities of what you can do with them. Cushions as well is another great thing, to whether it's a decoration or a functional purpose.
Tania sells kits, and I think it's going to be dangerous to go back to her booth because they're so beautiful, but they are doable. I was watching some YouTube videos just to get an idea of how they were made, and when you know the technique, it seems very approachable to be able to knit a Dorset button. And you have some here that have beads incorporated in them. Do you want to talk about those? Because that's adding a little bling to your knitting. I like that.
Yes, I love the beads. I love beads in knitting as well. So it was inevitable that I was going to use my beads in Dorset button. So this is definitely breaking away from tradition and making it contemporary. I think for me, the beads, yes, it's that extra sparkle, it's extra texture, it's extra colour. It just adds another dimension, and it can change the design too, because where you have beads, you're going to have more space happening. You can have beads and see through where they sit on the spoke and see the air behind, so to speak. Sometimes I make Christmas decorations and put beads in so they really sparkle as well. It's just another little dimension to add to them, but you can make them out of anything really, you know.
These are gorgeous. I'm really a fan of the ones with the beads, and again, like you just started rattling off other uses for them. So they're lovely little things that we can be doing to use up our odds and ends and add sparkle if we add beads, or just some more visual interest to our knitting. I did not hear about Dorset Buttons until this summer when I was learning about Loch Ness Knit Fest and what some of the classes were. And then I started looking into them and thinking, oh gosh, I need to learn more because I think I would enjoy making them. Unfortunately, I am headed back to the US now, so I'm not going to get to be into any of your classes, but would you like to tell people where they can find some classes you'll be teaching or how they can follow you to make sure that they don't miss out?
Thank you. Yes, I don't think I've got anything planned at the moment, not public ones. I've got private ones that people have booked me for, but I do have a website which is tjfrog.co.uk, and I'm also on Instagram and Facebook as tjfrogsky, and that's Sky with an E. Yes, so that's where you can find me to find out any more information or where you might see me at a yarn festival for a workshop.
Perfect. So everyone be sure that you hop over to social media and follow Tania, because not only will you be able to find out where you can find her, but you can see some more examples of these beautiful buttons and get some inspiration for that. So I want to thank you, Tania, for stepping away from your booth for a few minutes and coming to do this interview, and I hope that you have a wonderful, successful festival.
Thank you very much, Anne. It was lovely to meet you, having listened to your podcast. So thank you very much for meeting up with me today.
Tania was a real delight to talk to, and the next day she grabbed me and had me pick a Dorset Button kit for a listener. So keep listening to the end of the podcast and you'll get the details on how to win that. Thank you again, Tania, for your generosity. For our last song today, I have another love song for you. This one is quite a bit sillier and quirkier. Let's end on a happy note today. This is called I Feel Loved by Briand A. Melanson.
The sound of your voice makes everything better. You turn the grey sky into lovely weather. Even though I'm here and you are there, we always make the best out of what we can. Hey, 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 hey. When you call me up, I feel loved. 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 I feel loved. You're a tickle in my ear, dropping beats on my eardrum. We can talk for hours, never thinking that we're done. In my mind, we're in the middle of a cuddle. No matter where we are, we're a two-piece puzzle. We always make the best out of what we can. Oh, oh, oh. When you call me up, I feel loved. 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 The sound of your voice makes everything better. You turn the grey sky into lovely weather. Even though I'm here and you are there, we always make the best out of what we can. Oh, oh, oh. When you call me up, I feel loved. When you call me up, I feel loved. When you call me up, I feel loved. When you call me up, I feel loved.
A few more things before I go. There is a knit along in the works. More details should hopefully be available by next episode, so keep listening for that. If you are a designer, dyer, yarn manufacturer, shop owner, or whoever, and would like to provide a few prizes for those who participate, please be in touch. I will be going to Vogue Knitting Live on January 17th and 18th in New York City. I will be at the marketplace on the evening of the 17th. I'm taking the class called Steeks for Scaredy Cats on Saturday morning with Julia Farwell Clay, and then I will be back in the marketplace for the rest of the day. Sometime on Saturday, I'll be having a meet and greet. I'll get you the details on that closer to the time, but look forward to that and let me know if you're coming. I'll keep my eyes peeled for you. Finally, let's give away this Dorset Button kit from Tania Ashton Jones. This will be open to listeners worldwide. It's a Dorset Button bracelet kit with enough supplies to make 11 buttons. You can join them into a bracelet or two or use them as separate buttons for another project. The colors are pink and gray, and it comes with a pamphlet that gives instructions on how to make the buttons as well as some of the history of Dorset Buttons. To enter, find the episode post on Ravelry, Instagram, or Facebook and leave a comment, or send me an email to ann@familypodcasts.com. I will take entries from any of those 4 sources this time. This episode will launch on the evening of November 18th. I need to have your entries by 9 a.m. on November 29th, which is the day after Thanksgiving for Americans. That'll help you remember. I will have Siri pick a number randomly from all the entrants, and whoever's comment matches that number will be announced in episode 22. In the meantime, thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you would like to contact me, you can email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That's Ann with an E @familypodcasts.com. I'm on Ravelry, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube as I Thought I Knew How. If it's a place that allows you to put spaces between the words, then there are spaces between the words. Otherwise, it's all one word. The Facebook and Ravelry groups are both called I Thought I Knew How Podcast, and I'm on Twitter as @ThoughtIKnewHow. The website for the show is ithoughtIKnewHow.familypodcasts.com. There you will find the show notes for each episode. Every now and then I post a blog post there too. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.